Good morning, BookTube. Okay, so now we are getting into the fun stuff. I hope everyone's doing well. I was asked a couple times after my reading from the Brothers Karamazov about its connection with Children of Doro, which is a science fiction novel, space opera. It takes place on another world, a distant planet. It has aliens in it, specifically two other species, and it deals with the goings-on on a ship with an AI that is narrating the story. So I understand why people, after listening to my reading a couple weeks ago, well, I don't know when I'll be posting this, we'll see, might have been a little bit confused, because I read from the most famous chapter perhaps in the Brothers Karamazov, which is the Grand Inquisitor chapter, and that's where one of the four brothers of the tyrant Karamazov, the father, the patriarch, one of the four brothers, Ivan, the intellectual, is telling a story to Alyosha, his brother, who is much more spiritually driven, questing, looking for a way to move through the world. A story about how Christianity is unjust. And it's an odd kind of atheism, because Ivan is deeply compassionate, and the reason he can indict not just the church but also Christ for coming and leaving such a tall order in many ways for people on earth is from a place of deep compassion, deep love, deep horror at the trauma of the world. So when Ivan's telling the story, he is destroying, essentially tearing down the cultural foundations of his world. The Bible, Christianity are central to his civilization, and he's tearing them down out of love. It's a very complicated love, but it is out of love for how hard things are in that world, for the horror that one has when one looks around and sees people struggling. So there is a version of that in my world, in Children of Doro, and the core of it has to do with the fact that I have built my own world. So my character, my child of Doro, which I talked about in the last piece, Doro is the planet. It is a citizen government made up of every individual who happens to reside on the planet or be around it in a real-time governance structure made possible by future AI technology. Very temperamental for this reason, as temperamental as all of the citizens at any given point. The child of Doro is a citizen of Doro. In my piece, he is deconstructing a concept fundamental to this society. This world is part of a larger intergalactic compact between species. That compact is called the Partnership, and the Partnership has a foundational text, which it's so excited to have its member species translate into their own languages and loves to have conversation about. So it's not Christianity. It is the cultural milieu, which has its own canon of text, which has its own body of discourse, and around it, Jovil is the name of this character. Jovil comes from a non-human species in the text. Jovil is telling our protagonist, Alastri, my Alyosha is Alastri, my Ivan is Jovil, a story that highlights the twinned pain and frustration of having an awareness, having the capacity to construct for oneself essentially platonic ideals of things, of ideas like justice, and to have that platonic ideal live so deeply in oneself that one feels one knows it, one feels one understands this is justice, and yet it is such an intangible thing, and it cannot ever be fully realized, ever be fully embodied by the person. So my version of the Grand Inquisitor is called the Parasite's Lament, and it has this character embracing the folly of everyone's chosen philosophy when it's deeply held, when they think that they are doing right by the foundational text and the concepts of their civilization, how Jovil acknowledges that a person cannot do anything better than to try to throw themselves into an external narrative, an external philosophy, however broken that philosophy, simply because that core idea of justice or any other absolute Platonic ideal that lives within us can never be fully realized. And so there's a pain of disconnect. And that resonates a lot with, in the Grand Inquisitor, the idea that Christ's mission, when really thought about within the contexts provided by Ivan in the Brothers Karamazov, can never be fully realized by the vast majority of human beings. And there's pain in that. And as he presents in the Grand Inquisitor, the Church needs to provide a comforting illusion, a fiction in some ways, that can offer counsel and support and a promise to people who cannot fulfill the central core demanding mandate of the faith. So I think when you read this piece, you should be able to get plenty out of it, 100%, without having read Brothers Karamazov. I've had beta readers who've read this piece knowing a little bit about the Russian tone, about the Dostoevskian tone, but not having read the Brothers Karamazov, and recognizing that it is philosophical fiction. They were able to enjoy it. It being philosophical fiction means that we move through situations and they are explored. It's what some people would say, oh, it's a lot of exposition. Well, Neil Stephenson is half exposition. Kim Stanley Robinson has tons of exposition. People outline ideas when they're dealing with civilization level concerns, when they're trying to imagine better. It is a silly, reductive critique that often comes up because Western publishing is, well, like any publishing circuit, going to be a little bit gatekeepy and wants a lot more action. I will say there is a lot more action in the second half. The first half, though, let's get into it. The Brothers Karamazov has so many episodes, so many opportunities for people's ideas to be held in tension with one another. I chose a few key scenes from the Brothers Karamazov on which to hang this tale. One, of course, is the trial. The trial is very important to the original text. It's in, obviously, later parts of the volume. It comes after the murder of the father. It comes after a scapegoat needs to be found, and one of the brothers, a volatile brother, Dmitri, is such an easy mark for that, irrespective of the truth, so I'm not spoiling anything, but Dmitri is arrested and Dmitri is made to stand trial, and this is such an important part of the piece because Dostoevsky at the time is not just indicting Christianity. Christianity is not the whole of a society ever. There are many secular components, and so Dostoevsky is also looking at justice in its formations in secular culture by the end of the piece and recognizing the fickleness again. He talks a lot about the fickleness of human beings in this text, and in such a beloved way, but acknowledging that it's there. The fickleness of humanity comes up in two really key places. One is with the trial, in terms of people's views changing based on Dmitri giving a speech about culpability, because he has been somebody who has accused his father of many horrible things, and he's been heard saying, that he's going to kill him one day. He's an angry man, and he has spent his entire life being angry at his father. And there's an earlier scene, which is also extremely important, kind of a mirroring of this, when they sit in council with Father Zosima, a very important spiritual leader in this text. Alyosha has put himself at the disposal of this brother who is adored, is seen as a spiritual leader above so many others. This person just is incredibly wise and always has the right thing to say and can fix all problems that come before him. And so he is given the task of sitting with the Karamazov family to try to help them with a dispute too. So earlier on, before the secular trial, you have this situation with the spiritual council, so beloved by the people, at least until he dies. Zosima, when he dies, there's another really important scene. But before he dies, you have the patriarch show up in this dispute about inheritance. Essentially, Dmitri believes that he is entitled to far more from his mother's death, and yet he's already spent the inheritance he was given. So his accusation is much more existential, is that he should not have been given that inheritance in such a way. He was too young. He was obviously going to fritter it away, so his father owes him more. Very complicated inheritance story. And the patriarch is quite sneaky and sets things up to make his son late to this encounter so that the father can first harass and bother, essentially, Father Zosima, who is so adored by his other son, Alyosha. So it's a very humiliating situation for Alyosha, sitting there while his family is just making fools of themselves in some ways in front of this person that he adores and he's trying so much to learn from. And Zosima is an interesting character. The more I read the book, the more I wonder if anyone in this novel has an actual faith. Oh, that's the wrong way of putting it. There are two ways of thinking about faith. The idea of faith being something that one has, or faith being something that one thinks is necessary to affect. And honestly, the more I go through this book, the more I wonder how much all of these characters are affecting faith because they believe it is an important structure in society. Zosima too. There are things inside his commentary that make me wonder. But again, it's a rich text for that reason. Anyway, we have two parallel quote-unquote trials. In my piece, I do have two major mediations and then a trial. And the first mediation involves my version of Dmitri. Ceres is a citizen of the planet Doro, and Ceres feels that the Doran Council has been tremendously unjust, and the mediation is carried out by Leonid, who is my Zosima, and Leonid is somebody that my Alyosha, Alastri, looks up to and reveres and wants to learn from how to be better. Unfortunately, just as the trial in Dostoevsky's piece highlights the fickleness of people, so too does Zosima undergo the fickleness of humanity. When Zosima dies in the novel, there's an important scene. He's been so revered, everyone's thought for sure he's a saint among us. And then his body rots very quickly. And the rot of his body, the swiftness of it, seems to belie all of that notion of his sainthood. And so people turn from him very quickly upon his death, which again is very common to the human species. We are fickle. And Leonid too does something with his own death that causes people to turn from him and causes them to sort of despise his memory even after they adored him. So hopefully that framed a little bit of the situations. In my piece, the first half of the novel is framed around the first mediation, the idea of meeting all of the children of Doro as they sit in a conversation, in a mediation space with Leonid over this crisis. That's the first half of the novel. And through that, our narrator tells you all about the backstories and the wild goings-on of each key character. There's also a point when you hear about Leonid's backstory, the same way that Alyosha learns some of the backstory about Zosima in private. And Alyosha, when he hears that, he also has mixed feelings because the backstory of this revered saintly figure is very human, and it also complicates for him his feelings for this figure. Doesn't ruin them, but complicates them. And so this first half of the piece goes through my Dmitri, my Alyosha, my Ivan, a little bit of my Smerdyakov. We'll talk about Smerdyakov next. My Leonid. And you will get all of the different characters in their subject positions. You will learn about the world they inhabit through all of that, through one mediation, through a failed mediation that happens one day when Alastri is 17, that my ship's AI contends will be responsible for the destruction of a world 25 years on. And you do get a little bit of that tease at the beginning, because right from the opening of the piece, which I will read from, not this time, maybe in another piece, You have Alastri introduced. Oh, you know what? No, let's do the very first paragraph. The very first paragraph is in the it's in the AI's preface. And as I mentioned, even that preface is something taken from the book, because Dostoevsky begins with a preface that explains the interest in Alyosha. And you can see in that preface, in Dostoevsky, the possibility that he meant for his book to be 2 books. It's there, it's coded into the first. It doesn't need to have been, it stands on its own with a little bit of an unfinished quality to it, but you can see that he was pouring quite a bit out there, and quite a bit of love. Alyosha is a name taken from his dead son, so there's a lot going in there. But just to give you a little taste, the very first line, we'll do the first paragraph from the AI's preface. Captain Alastri of the late Planet Doro showed no surprise when a mutiny aboard the Essence of Dawn found her forced into an escape pod instead of murdered alongside an even 50% of the crew. It was not that Alastri took this act of clemency for granted, as a right afforded her by partnership rank and station, but rather, once it happened, as established fact, the inevitable collapse of all possible cosmic outcomes to a single result. In all the time that I have observed Alastri, either directly or through records from periods outside my immediate purview, I have never found her to do otherwise with the circumstances of her adult life. So right from the beginning, you know that the planet's going to die. It's going to, did I say? No, just the late Planet Doro. I didn't say necessarily the explosion right there. The explosion will come up soon. The planet's going to die. There's going to be a mutiny aboard Captain Alastri's ship. She's going to survive that mutiny, but half of her crew is going to be slaughtered. So there is action. It's just differently presented. There's still definitely a very strong quote-unquote expositional quality as the AI is narrating all of these stories, all of these backstories, all of these interactions, holding in tension everyone. That's the first half. The second half, we go forward to after the destruction of the planet, and we are also moving through and mitigating the AI's attempt to clarify everything's fine, it's not breaking down, it's not going through a kind of PTSD for AIs, it's totally objective, and everything it's written is not an obsessive compulsive fixation on a character as a coping mechanism for its trauma. So there is a lot of unreliability, I hope, that you will see very clearly in the text, because it is very clearly in the text. It's meant to be there. You're meant to be holding in tension whether all of the outsized acclaim that the AI is giving to Alastri is legitimate, and if its claims about the series of events are legitimate, or if it's just a sign of deep malfunction after tremendous trauma. So in the second half, we have essentially the fallout of the murder, which is what connects it with the original text as well. And the fallout of the murder has its own complicated outcomes. Inside that second half, there are so many other facets of Brothers Karamazov that I have blended in. I mean, sometimes it's small details too. There's one scene in Brothers Karamazov where Dmitri is taken in by the police and he's feeling very humiliated because the police are inspecting his undies. I have an equivalent scene to that. So on the very tiny detail level, there are lots of little pieces here. Oh yes, there are some other characters that I mentioned in the piece. Alyosha has a friend, quote unquote, someone he thinks is a friend, but this academic associate is not actually a friend. Rakitin is constantly trying to find opportunities to bring Alyosha down because he resents him. He resents that piousness, that pursuit of something better. And there is a woman as well in the original that is quite frustrating. A little bit in terms of representation of women. There are some better, and at the time period, you're not going to get necessarily the most evolved roles for women. And I'm not talking about Dostoevsky not writing them with compassion. I'm saying the society does not leave many great roles for women at the time. And so you have my original. Dmitri from Brothers Karamazov and his father are also in competition over a woman. And that woman is somebody that the friend, quote-unquote friend of Alyosha, also tries to set up to tempt Alyosha. And so obviously I'm not going to have that kind of seductress scene or that kind of manipulation. There isn't really romance in my piece at all. This is not a book about relationships. But I do have my version of a temptation created to fall. In the wake of Zosima's death, Alyosha is laid low and is more open to, more vulnerable to that kind of worldly temptation. And yet, in that moment where Rakitin tries to set Alyosha up for failure, one kindness from Grushenka changes his mind and just fortifies him again. And I have an equivalent situation at the end of the first half. I also mentioned Smerdyakov as being a problem, so while we're talking about the women, let's talk about that. Because there is another woman in the main text, that is Katya Katarina, and she is somebody who has tried to help Dmitri, and in trying to help Dmitri, her pride has gotten in the way of her detangling herself from him, so Dmitri continues to be just a difficult presence in her life, but she keeps trying to go high when he goes low and trying to be there and support him, hoping that maybe he'll grow up, maybe he'll become better. And I have a version of that here with Hecate. The other woman that's really important to this text is not really a central character, but she is the mother of the fourth child. And Lizaveta is very complicated character. Reeking Lizaveta is the name that she's given in Brothers Karamazov, and there are strong reasons to feel that she is a mentally disabled person. She's mute as well, but there's a complicated treatment of all of that in the original text, where she gains certain quote-unquote saintly qualities from being somebody who is quote-unquote simple, quote-unquote mute, less able to engage with society in normal ways, and the way that she moves through the world gives other people to pity her, kind of like a saint among the poor because of these disabilities. So not a great treatment, and it gets worse because Fyodor Karamazov, we're going to say it, rapes her 100%. It is not a great scenario. He is abusive towards women. He forces himself upon her, and she has a son. And the son is the son of the reeking one, Smerdyakov. And in my piece, his name is Reek. I did not want to have, and I wasn't going to have, any of these kinds of fetishistic ways of thinking about disability in my piece. And Smerdyakov has epilepsy. He himself is quite a bitter and struggling person. And I did not want any of that to be made manifest in my piece, but I still wanted to embody the character in a context that elevated all elements. So my Lizaveta is another AI that one can read as both foolish or deeply wise, depending, without the disability component, in the way that it's been presented. It's not that I'm trying to erase disability from the world at all, but there's just something icky about some of the fetishization and that twin line to fetishization that I didn't want. So DESMA is a unit that Partnership is really excited by, because Partnership loves its core text. It loves the idea that it's based on the Sun Master's journey. That's the core text of its empire, of its civilization. And so it decides, what if we set up an AI that's built and predicated upon the Sun Master's journey? What if it provides justice from the justice we see in those pages? You can see where this is going. Can you imagine an AI that's been built on different versions of the Bible and asked to rule based on that? So DESMA synthesizes all of that text and is sent to govern the Planet Doro before the Doran Council, and it is a disastrous failure for reasons that relate to the fact that the stories in the text are not sufficient to reflect the world the way that real people respond. So DESMA is both considered deeply wise because at her core she's carrying the foundation story of the civilization, but when she tries to apply it to provide judgment, it completely falls apart. Everyone turns against her. So there's that twist. She becomes stored away. the Doran Council comes into control. And the Doran Council, one key part of this is the Doran Council during terrible seasons in the planet doesn't want to be on the planet anymore because its complement doesn't want to be on the planet anymore. In the middle of the deep freeze of the planet, it hates its existence, it wants to leave, so of course the Council also wants to leave. And so the Council tries to escape into a more mobile form. It puts itself into the DESMA unit to try to escape, to try to use this mobile unit for transfer. That doesn't work either. And what's formed between the two when those two systems merge is Reek, a hybrid AI that carries an imprint of the Doran Council at one point of its existence, and DESMA, its other source of parent code that was itself based on the very complicated body of text known as the Sun Master's Journey. So, I went through quite a few different things in many different ways. I wanted to illustrate that I have brought a lot of Brothers Karamazov into this piece. There's another really important scene. You get it in the second half because after the explosion of the world Captain Alastri, the Essence of Dawn, they are helping the refugees, the survivors, and in one of those scenes, there's also a really important scene with my equivalent of a little boy who attacks everyone to be attacked and even sort of bites the hand that feeds him when Alyosha tries to help him. Alyosha's brother Dmitri has humiliated this child's father, and that has caused an unbearable amount of suffering for the child of the household, who then instigates things with others in the area so that others will attack him too. He's just living horrifically with this complex sense of survivor's guilt in some way of being in the household with so much shame, and he has nowhere to put it all, and so he provokes others so that they'll hurt him because that's what he feels like is the only thing left to him at this point. And Alyosha intervenes when he sees a bunch of boys attacking this child, and when Alyosha intervenes to help him, the child lashes out at him because he's a Karamazov. He's brother of the man who humiliated the child's father. And so for Alyosha, a really important part of his growth as a spiritual figure, as a person trying to move through the world in a compelling and compassionate way, is to try to heal this very complicated child who lashes out at everyone from their own place of hurt. And that too has the space in my piece, followed by the trial, followed by so much of the other injustices. But I do remediate my version of Smerdyakov because Smerdyakov deserved better than he got in Brothers Karamazov. And there are so many other places where I think we get to negotiate slightly different themes, slightly different concepts, but still on some profoundly insightful base forms that are present in the Brothers Karamazov. So really, I am in conversation already with at least one work in this piece, and I hope you'll see it too. But if you haven't read it, you don't have to read Brothers Karamazov. I'm just saying that there's plenty here for folks who have. And if you haven't, just go in recognizing it is philosophical sci-fi. It is not a pew-pew space opera. You are going to be moving through ideas. You're going to be moving through understanding the context in which those ideas are carried by individuals who have different subject positions in constant collision. So hopefully there will be something there for you to enjoy. We'll move on next to talking a little bit about the Sun Master's journey and world building, because I think for writers that might be an interesting theme. Thanks so much for listening, and good luck with whatever you're reading or writing right now. I hope it also serves you in good standing.